Prior to 2011, did you keep a journal or any kind of writing?
You know, no, not really, no. And I was practicing law, and the thing I loved about law always was my favorite part was always writing. I did a lot of appellate work, which is, the appeal. So you're not, in the courtroom, you're writing about what's there. And then my last job as a lawyer is putting together programs, but I was also editing articles and writing stuff up. And obviously the output is very different when you're a lawyer and when you're writing for kids. But I think there are skills that are really transferable. First is like, you have to sit down every day and write if you have to write. And sometimes you're not sure exactly what you're going to say, but you have to try to get something down on the page and know you're going to revise. So that was helpful. Also, my work was always edited by someone else, and not kind of like it is now, in the sense like, well, what are you trying to say here? What's this argument about? And so having to be in that back and forth with someone else is great for when you actually have to work with an editor, or if you're listening to critique partners. So I think that was really helpful. Also, you have to really think about audience. Obviously, the audiences might be very different, but you fundamentally, even though I do try to write for myself, and sometimes I am my audience, just because if it's not amusing to me, then it's probably not going to be as amusing to anyone else. But eventually you have to think like, well, who am I talking to here? And finally you have to think like, what's the point? I'm like, sometimes when I'm writing a scene, it can be really overwhelming, right? Because I'm like, I know I'm here and I gotta get here. At least that's how I feel. I don't know if you ever feel that way writing a scene, but it's just like, what am I doing here? And sometimes I'll be step back and be like, okay, what are like the 2 things max I want to get the reader to get out of this? And then I can build up to it and figure out how to get there. But like in this scene, there's going to be a lot of, I don't want to say talk, because I think it all builds the character and all builds the mood and all builds the setting. But fundamentally, there's like something the reader has to take away. I might not even want the reader to know explicitly like, oh, I'm taking away this one thing. That's showing versus telling. But as a lawyer too, sometimes you might have lots of case law, or there might be lots of history, and it's all important to build your case. But at the same time, you have to know what's like the 1 or 2 things for this section that I want people to walk away with, and how do I write something so that in the end, that's what they're going to remember. So even though I wasn't writing fiction, I think those skills I was working on, and I think that's definitely helped me as a writer.
Well, it sounds like much more, I don't know if comfortable is the right word, but if you're getting feedback on what you're writing, but it's an objective thing that you're writing about factual information and law, as opposed to here's a whole piece of my heart, go ahead and critique it. that
Well,
might
sure.
be
Sure. And yes, I will say emotionally, it is easier to have your legal work critiqued, but I do think it does. And I had some bosses who I loved, but were not, would be like, well, what are you trying to argue here? Well, why didn't you just say that? So that did help me be like, okay, and depersonalize it a little bit. When it is a piece of your heart, it's a little harder to depersonalize. And I've certainly, gone back and been like, but although I will say, I think in terms of feedback, that as a writer, there's sort of 2 kinds. One is from sort of your agent or editor, which you can disagree with, but you probably want a really good reason for disagreeing with it, because at that point, you're all in it together to make this work, and hopefully they have a similar vision to you and all of that. But there's also feedback, from critique partners or people who don't know you, or a paid SCBWI critique. And I've also given them too. So I'm not even saying that like this is just a receiver. Sometimes people don't always understand what you're trying to do with your work. And it's okay to get feedback, I think, especially when it is a piece of your heart and not, as a lawyer, something you're just, giving to a judge and someone says, well, this argument could be written more clearly. To be like, that's maybe not even bad feedback, but that's not the story I want to write. And I feel like that's one of the hardest things as a writer, to kind of learn how to sift through those things. But it is okay to, especially, you know, if you don't feel like the person understands what you're trying to do, to say, you know what, that's, you know, and not necessarily to them. To them, you say, thank you very much because of taking the time to read your work. But internally, saying, you know what, I don't think that, like, that doesn't feel right for what I'm trying to do with the story. Like, that's okay. It's your story. So
one nice thing about some types of feedback is, even if it's off the mark, but I can't wait until you write your version of the story that's going to be what you just suggested. But if you're saying that you're having a problem with something, even if your solution isn't right, the way you're describing the problem will help me figure out my solution, which is still made of win.
yeah, 100%. And there was one thing on this book where I disagreed with my editor, I thought, but I also agreed with, I think she's brilliant, and I agreed with, you know, like 98% of everything else. So I thought, let me try it. And I was like, not doing it. And then I thought, well, you know what, maybe the problem isn't this scene. Maybe it's sort of, I mean, I can tweak this scene a little bit, but maybe what's really happening is the scenes leading up to this scene aren't written in the way that would give this scene the payoff it is, right? So what I really need to do is not necessarily tweak here, but kind of go back and find all the other places I can tweak, so that in the end, this chapter does feel right, you know, right? So exactly, the solution isn't just here, but maybe it's identifying something where I can make it stronger other places in the work. But every now and then, you know, someone just, I mean, I remember this was in a short story class I took at the Writer Center, and I was writing this story that was kind of very coming of agey, and some people in my group really wanted it to be like a romance novel where there was a cat fight between two girls, and I was like, but I remember going back and being really sad and like, what, they don't get my work, and it was like, now, like, I feel like they just wanted a different story that I wasn't writing, and like, that's cool. They can go read the cat fight romance, but I don't want to be the one to write that. Do you know what I mean? So sometimes it's like, yes, you're identifying a problem, but sometimes, especially if it's, and I think that's the difference, especially if it's not someone who's also invested in the work or doesn't necessarily know you as a person, sometimes it's just not the best feedback because they want a different story altogether, and no one's wrong, but that's not the story you're writing. And it's okay to be like, okay, I'm not writing the catfight romance. We're good.
Everyone in Critique Partners has had a suggestion for me to add zombies, and they never do. Well.